Excellent. Thank you all for coming tonight. I see there's 25 and counting on the call, so welcome everybody. My name is Amanda Delawisio. I am part of the team at Fairfield Yabantu. Thank you for coming to the second event in our How the House Was Built series. For those who were here last week, I guess for everybody actually, we heard from activists all around the world, all around the country and Hawaii, about the good work that they're doing, and then the leaders that have supported them, past and present leaders that have influenced and supported their work. And I definitely left last week feeling like very hope-filled, and I know a lot of other people did. So we're just really, I was grateful for that night, and we're grateful to all who came and all who shared. Before we get started tonight, I have two announcements. The first one is about next week's event. I just want to get it in there before we start so that the conversation can just go and I don't have to worry about it later. Next week's event on Wednesday, the 24th, also at 7:30, is going to be a very special night. Our guest for the conversation on education could not be better. First, we have award-winning and totally incredible Dr. Yolanda Sealy-Ruiz from the Teachers College at Columbia. You might know her from another Fairfield Yabantu event where she came and spoke about her book of poetry called Love from the Vortex. Our other guest, also from the Teachers College at Columbia, is Dr. Christopher Emden. He is unbelievable, noted author, speaker, creator of hip hop ed. We are just unbelievably excited to have them, and we invite all of you back definitely to join us for that next Wednesday. The second announcement is because we at Fairfield Yabantu believe education and advocacy go hand in hand, right? Talking must lead to action, which leads to more talking, which leads to more action. So I want to remind everybody that we are supporting a GoFundMe page for friend and colleague of Hannah, Cynthia Dorsey, who has been a nurse for 17 years, who worked on the front lines as a bedside nurse with COVID patients, and who was recently diagnosed with breast cancer. So she has been showing up for our community for a very long time, and now it's time for our community to show up for Cynthia. So hopefully during this conversation, maybe somebody can put the link in the chat for that GoFundMe page. And it's really important to show up to these events, but also show up in other ways. So I encourage everybody to do that. Tonight's event is it's going to be a really, really interesting discussion, and I'm super psyched for it. It's about the history of redlining and housing segregation, and how the planning and implementation of those policies continues to affect Fairfield. And in order to get us started, I want to introduce our friend Lori at the Fairfield Museum and History Center, one of the co-sponsors of this event. Take it away, Lori.
Thank you, Amanda, and good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all again, and maybe some new faces. It's such an honor to be here tonight with Fairfield Yabantu to help support this program and to introduce our guest speaker, Sonya Huber. I first met Sonya when she was doing research at the Fairfield Museum and History Center, where I work as the director of interpretation. And as soon as I met her, I was like, wow, she is a prolific researcher and writer, and her curiosity and her ways of connecting not only primary resources and documents, but acknowledging how those things impacted today's community here in Fairfield was just a joy to get to know and an honor to listen to and work with her as she was doing her research at the museum. And so tonight, I'm, honored to, number one, introduce Sonya, but also really excited to be here because at the Fairfield Museum, our mission is to bring people together from a variety of backgrounds and to have conversations that can bring us together for an understanding, empathy, to be able to welcome a better future for our community. And so with that, this speaker series, How the House Was Built, is important to us, and it is important today in our community as we reflect on all of the history to brought us to where we stand today, in ourselves and our individual lives, but also in the communities and neighborhoods that we live in. And so with that, I would love to welcome Sonya Huber, who is also a professor in the Department of English at Fairfield University. And like I mentioned, prolific writer and researcher. And I'm honored to be able to introduce her tonight. And thanks so much for joining us. Sonya, I am going to pass it over to you.
Sonya, I'm so sorry. I'm going to interrupt
no problem.
for 1 second because I forgot a very, very, very important thing. And that is a reminder of our community norms. So Lori, that was brilliant. I'm totally busting in here, but I'm going to hand it to Chrissy first to remind us about how the night's going to go.
Thank you, Amanda. So these are our community agreements, and we have borrowed these from the Space Collective, which was a great way to we really enjoyed their agreements that they set up here, and I think that they are applicable to our purposes here tonight, and just good reminders in general when we're having conversations like this. So the first is to speak from your own experience, only talk about yourself, not others. So focus on the personal and not on others. I really like the acronym WAIT, which stands for why am I talking, or also why am I not talking? Maybe you're somebody that jumps in a little too frequently, or else you might have something that's brewing inside that you really should be sharing with us. What is said here stays here, and what is learned here leaves here. So we hope that you do gain a lot of information here tonight, and take that as you go out into our community and advocate for our mission. We hope that you seek growth rather than closure. You're not always going to find that nice, easy closure, especially when we're having difficult conversations. And acknowledge those ouch and oops moments. If someone says something that personally affects you, it is your right. And we welcome you to say, ouch, hey, that hurt me. Or if you are the person that has said something that landed on someone else in not the way that you intended it, it's okay to say oops and to admit that that's not where you wanted your comment to go. And lean into the discomfort that you might feel when we have conversations like this. And finally, to just be curious before you are critical. And just, before jumping on someone or assuming the worst, kind of think, well, where are they coming from and what might that have meant? So I like also be curious rather than certain is another way to phrase that.
Great.
Trey, do you want to talk about Ubuntu quickly?
Sure. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I hope you're all well. As always, I like to start everything I do with this Ubuntu philosophy and reminder. All right, and it reads that we are made to live in a delicate network of interdependence with one another. Right, a person is a person through other persons, and the solitary human being is a contradiction in terms. A totally self-sufficient human being is ultimately subhuman. We are made for complementarity. I have gifts that you do not, and you have gifts that I do not. So we need each other to be fully human. Desmond Tutu, just an emphasis on, I think, humility and the willingness to work together. Yeah. Thank you all so much for joining me in this work.
All right.
Sonya?
Okay, now, without further ado, Sonya.
All right. Well, thanks so much to Trey and everyone for inviting me to speak. I'm really honored. I'm here not because I'm an expert on zoning, but I will give you at the end ways to get in touch with people who are and people who are doing some great activist work. I'm more of a storyteller and researcher. So what I'm going to try to do pretty quickly is kind of go through 4 or 5 centuries really quick and kind of show the ways in which what started with white settlement in the 1600s is still really with us today in different forms on the landscape where we live. So I invite us to think about zoning as a really broad term that really means who is able to live where. And it's a very old story and it keeps repeating. So that today, when we see phrases that trigger a sense of confusion, like zoning or low-income housing or zoning commission meeting, we have to step back and see all those things as part of the deep history of the land. So the first version of zoning that happened here in Fairfield County, Connecticut, were laws that were passed pretty soon after white people arrived in the early to mid 1600s, and they prevented African people and indigenous people from moving through the town of Fairfield. So there were a lot of laws that said that you couldn't go through the town without permission. There were curfews, there were fines, and non-white people could be shot on sight. So this is a form that that has continued in many ways through until today. So what happened gradually was that this land, which was the homeland of the Paugusset, who became the Golden Hill Paugusset, was gradually taken away in a series of land agreements. And the Paugusset community was gradually impoverished, lost their hunting grounds, and were then moved to originally an 80-acre reservation in Bridgeport that was on where Golden Hill is now. And so it was called the Golden Hill Reservation. And the wild thing about that, among many other things, is that Fairfield essentially outsourced its responsibility for the Paugusset tribe that had lived on its land to what was then Stratford. So it paid Stratford, you know, a certain number of coats and bags of peas and grain in exchange for saying, could you please take this tribe and let us wash our hands of these people? So that's the original and sort of really overt example among others of very strict race-based and person-based control of the land. So it's important because that's the same logic that was used again and again for taking away land and control of land. So zoning has the logic also that not only does zoning control often purchase price, but it also can control in many cases what you do with the land after you buy it. So, and we'll talk more about how that is used today. So fast forward through the 1700s and into the 1830s, displaced Paugussetts came together with free Africans and African Americans and settled in South Bridgeport in a community called Little Liberia that I hope many of you have heard of. And if you haven't, one of the links that I'll drop in the chat at the end is to the Freeman Center in Bridgeport. Many great activists are working to build that as a center of culture and community. So this was really an amazing example of people pushed out through the price of land and through segregation into the least desirable plot of land, and they're making a community. So making a way out of no way. And indigenous people at the time had a really difficult choice, either to assimilate or to be forcibly moved west. So that is the genesis of that community. So at the same time, in the background, a number of things were happening that led people to think, okay, a community can be built and controlled like a machine. So we've got the Industrial Revolution, we've got planned communities where everything was assumed, you know, that we could control everything and make a utopian place where people could live in complete harmony. There were all these ideals, both positive and negative. The cities here in Connecticut boomed, not only Bridgeport, but Stamford, Norwalk, Danbury, all kinds of little and big industrial sites. And that drew immigrants who were only for the most part able to live in apartment buildings in the city. So this is an important era because this pathologized what were called, quote, slums and tenements. It's another logic that really is still with us. But at the time, people thought that poverty grew not from bad wages, but from apartment buildings themselves and gatherings of people. So this is also connected to the theory of the racist theory of eugenics, which says that certain people, poor people, people of color, were inherently degenerate. And so the thinking was that separation was the way to maintain some sort of racial control. So this came out of a model of a sociological school from the University of Chicago. And they really saw cities as akin to a forest. And they saw a city that was going through economic changes as like a rotting log. So the model was that a city would, this is what they said, would rot from the center outward. And that this rot would spread, and that was poverty. And so the goal of building cities at the turn of the century and into the 1920s was to contain poverty and contain the infiltration. So really, I mean, it's equating poor people and people of color with mold and rot, which is pretty offensive. So this meant, what are the different methods of containment? In some cases, they were really overt, like concrete barriers. And in many other cases, it's more legislative and financial acts like zoning. So in the late 1800s, farmland, especially around here, was beginning to be really cheap because we have the trains bringing produce in from other areas of the country. So people saw a way to make a lot of money quick. And what that was to take farmland located around train stations, and this happened pretty early on in Long Island, by a real estate developer named Mark Maher, who then moved here to Bridgeport and Fairfield. What he would do is section off a whole development and then resell the plots at a high minimum price. So a high price, starting price that a house had to be built on, and a high, and all these different restrictions. So a high certain number of square footage, and all these restrictions in effect kept poor people out of these developments. So Mark Maher then moved here, and he focused on the dividing line between Bridgeport and Fairfield. And what he really did was build up a series of developments that are, you can trace them, that are today like sandbags along the line between Bridgeport and Fairfield. It's fascinating. He developed tracts in Grassmere and near Fairfield Museum. And he even specified what kind of fences could be built and whether someone could build a shed. So he really created a sense of tight uniformity in these subdivisions. So these private developments made segregation into a product that white people bought. Quiet was sold as a product, and the need for quiet came because people's fear of social movements and fear of people of color were whipped up by conservative forces. After this private phase, then came legal backing for zoning. And so the next product that was offered was essentially prefabricated packets of zoning laws that a municipality could buy, adapt, and fill in the blanks, and then pass. And so these specified that different parts of a city or a community were to be built, were to be reserved for different uses. in many cases, like the Gold Coast, one of the most important and really heavy restrictions was to take the vast majority of a whole town and to set it aside for only single family homes. And so we know that sort of the image of the bucolic suburban community is everybody wants their starter home and a home of your own. But in practice, what that means is that if you don't have the money for a pretty expensive down payment or to buy into a certain community, you're not able to enter, right? And so that's part of the effect of generations of segregation that we see. So towns like Fairfield piled most of their industry also along the city border. So we've got Black Rock and Grasmere. And then towns like Greenwich and Darien in particular, began to see that it was such a massive financial benefit to have almost all of their building lots built with large homes. That means tons of tax dollars, right? So there's also then a huge financial incentive for towns to continue this zoning practice. So then sort of the last piece of the puzzle is that in the 1920s and 1930 came the Great Depression. Everybody was losing their homes, right? And not able to pay their mortgages. So, and this is where the practice of redlining officially comes into the fore. And you may have heard this term. Basically, what it meant is that the government paid local teams of real estate agents to go out and make surveys of every building, every lot in urban areas and suburban areas. And the ratings were, neighborhoods were coded into letter ratings based on who lived there. So I've seen the actual worksheets that were used for neighborhoods in Bridgeport and Fairfield. And there are check boxes where someone could mark if there are Black people, if there are immigrants. And then there's comment boxes where the realtors make predictions about where this neighborhood is going to be in 5 or 10 years. And these then become completely self-fulfilling prophecies because the neighborhoods with majority white people were then given priority for mortgage assistance, right? And neighborhoods where there are majority people of color or lots of immigrants were seen as more of a risk for banks. So they weren't given financial assistance. And then you could see how quickly that would lead to a landlord not being able to repair a building, right? And capital not being able to be available to refurbish homes. So that's a way in which the economic divide really widened. And so the theory behind redlining, again, played on this same idea of infiltration, that it was really important to separate good neighborhoods from bad neighborhoods because poverty was catching like mold or like a virus. And so, you know, you can see the DNA of segregation really working here. And you can see too that there's a we use the term bad neighborhood all the time, right? And what we mean there is this racially coded bad people in reality. So today, I live in Stratford and I see it in arguments in Stratford. There is a huge fear of affordable housing. Right? There's, while we can't say we don't want more people who are low income, or we don't want more people of color who've been historically undercompensated and oppressed, it's in polite society still okay in a state like Connecticut to oppose affordable housing. And the truth is that there are very few apartments in most suburbs, and it's endemic in the Gold Coast. So in many of our communities in the Gold Coast, minimum home prices are really high. There are minimum lot sizes. And if you go to a zoning commission meeting, there are often code words that are used. So people will say, not, we don't want poor people, but we want to maintain a certain quality of life, right? Or we have concerns about the traffic, or we have concerns about safety. And these are sort of code words that are used today to oppose the construction of low-income housing. And meanwhile, in the cities, there's a snowball effect. It's actually not that much cheaper to live in Bridgeport, but there are more apartments. And the taxes are higher in a city like Bridgeport because more people need social services, and there are just total more people in a city. Because social services and the schools are overburdened, you have more stress on the basic infrastructure of a city, while there is more money for infrastructure in the suburbs. And there's a whole nother financial piece that I can't even get into, but there's a lot of issues with taxation. I'll just leave it at that. So the issue now is that, and this is what I'll sort of end with, is that the battle to provide low-income housing in the suburbs is seen as one of the really important ways at trying to undo segregation that has really been with us since the 1600s. There's really important work done by the Kirwan Institute in Ohio, they've done this thing called opportunity mapping, and they've seen that the future class mobility of a child can be distilled down to the number of people within a 0.6 mile radius who have access to regular employment. So that is, that's such a small radius, right? And so it's a very real measure of access to progress and mobility. There in Fairfield, there's an affordable housing committee, and people have fought for years to try and get more low-income housing. In zoning commission meetings, people will get really upset about protecting the way of life, often protecting historic structures, protecting wetlands, worrying about traffic control. This has been happening over the past few years in Fairfield, you might have seen, with a struggle over an affordable housing development on Holland Hill, and it's gotten quite heated. People are taught to be afraid of low-income apartments, but the truth is that after they're there, people don't even notice them. It's the threat of poor people that relies on a monster that is literally 4 centuries old. The idea of neighborhoods as pieces of bread that get moldy and that can spread mold to others. It's a ridiculous assumption based on eugenics. Right now, unfortunately, the application to get low-income, the process of getting low-income housing into an affluent community is really long, and it often involves going to court. And so this is extra money that developers don't have. Luckily, actually, I will do this right now. I'm going to paste into the chat a really amazing set of resources. And one of these you might have heard of is the Open Communities Alliance in Connecticut. Oh my gosh, Erin Boggs, who runs that, is a superstar. And you can go to that website, sign up for their newsletters. They are having all kinds of events. And she's done a lot of speaking in Fairfield. And part of what they're doing is they're setting up a housing trust to try and help developers get through the deadlock of these zoning commission meetings. So they're a great ally. And, you know, in many communities down the Gold Coast, people who own their own homes and who have apartments and carriage houses aren't allowed to rent them. So people are actually restricted in many of the towns from even offering rental on their own. Westport famously within the last 5 years purchased a plot of land that was going to be turned into affordable housing and turned it into public gardens and a parking lot. So the examples just go on and on. But I think the most important thing that I wanted to stress is that I really feel like we have this association with zoning as being like boring, but it is really what has created the consciousness of white people, I believe. Zoning codes are one of the faces of perpetuation of racism because they map into the heads of so many white people a very homogenous version of home and comfort that is almost that it gets loaded in before any later logical discussions about complexity and economics. So yeah, I think that it's important to talk about all this stuff. I'm very happy to continue to chat, and thanks for bearing with me through the centuries. This really quick overview.
Oh my gosh, Sonya, thank you so much.
Sure.
That was amazing. That was really amazing. I think you did a great job taking us through those years and helping outline just how on purpose both the rhetoric and the planning and the implementation of these policies has been, and how widespread, sort of economic and legislative and legal and all the things. Now we have time for discussion. I want to turn it over to Trey to add some thoughts about Fairfield today, if you would, and then really encourage everybody to flesh out some of these ideas a little more, especially that last piece, how this has shaped understandings of whiteness, and our own understanding of whiteness and comfort and neighborhood is really an important question. So
Sonia, thank you so much. You know how I feel. I appreciate your work and coming on to this. My heart is heavy. I mean, truth be told, this is difficult for me. This is difficult to navigate. It's disheartening. So I part of in planning this house, how the house was built. I wanted to. It was an attempt to bring to light, so to speak, the varying ways in which racism affects the experience, so to speak, within Fairfield, the Black experience, and its insidious nature. Okay, and redlining, I thought was one of them. And I also have a personal experience, so to speak, with what this is, right? What it looks like in real life. You know, if you read the program, it talks about how we're going to look at the past, but also, so to speak, anecdotes of how it's present today and in real life experiences. And I experienced this with my mom buying or trying to buy a house in Fairfield. Um, the process in which the realtor tried so hard to ensure that she didn't get a house in Fairfield. And as Sonya said, right, maintaining the look, right, maintaining the narrative. So my mom, you good with the story, right? Can I say it? Yeah, we're good. So my mom for years had a vision of buying a home, and is a health professional and had the money to buy this house. But it took her years to finally purchase the house. And it wasn't because she didn't have the money, but it was because in the process of looking for a house and identifying the house that she wanted, her realtor would discourage her to buy the house, especially when it was in the heart of Fairfield, or, you know, in the inner um, boundaries of Fairfield. And oftentimes the realtor would discourage her because for varying reasons. One of them was that she couldn't drive. Another one was that concerned about how the rural area, it seemed to rule for her, being an older lady, so on and so forth. And along her journey, she would find herself almost having to justify why she'd have to live there, right? Or assure the realtor that it would work out for her socially. She spent a lot of times telling the realtor who I knew or that I was a teacher in town, and all these varying things to get the realtor to hear her out. And it was only until the realtor met me, and I think looked me up and confirmed that I was a teacher in town, that she took a little bit more of an interest in my mom's seriousness of being able to afford a house. But the caveat here was that I had my partner, Amanda, and I were working and doing some social service work and so on and so forth. And it was through that connection that the realtor took us seriously. The social capital almost, right, that we apparently had, that led the realtor to actually consider my mom's efforts and seriousness of buying a home. And I remember on the phone with the three of us, me, realtor, and Amanda, because we were doing something else about a different project, that the realtor said, proceeded to ask how close we were. And after that had been revealed, then the realtor turned around literally the same day, approached my mom and said, let's go and get you that house. Well, all along, it had been various reasons for why she shouldn't be in that, including that it was already bought. And too often the house was never actually bought. These are real examples of how folks have been trying to keep people out of this town, maintaining a certain look. And I know that that is a serious thing because of the looks that we get right in town, even still. So Sonya, what you said is real, and it really resonated with me, and it pains me because there are children who are um, struggling because of this investment in hatred, really, right? And a eugenics culture. So, with that anecdote, I would love to welcome folks to kind of join us in an open conversation, right, Chrissy? This is that time to kind of reflect with Sonia and all of us. Thank you for letting me share.
I'd like to share a little bit about something that happened to me recently. And Sonia, thank you for the education. A lot of what you said are things that I felt or kind of knew existed, but didn't really affect me directly. So I don't give much thought to it, right? I live in the north end of Bridgeport, and I live in a house that's about 7 blocks where my wife grew up and her parents still live. And her mom was over at our house earlier on in the week. It was like a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of the day. And I said to her mom, take your coat off. Come on, I'll put on some tea. We'll hang out. And she said to me, well, no, you know, my purse is in the car. I don't feel comfortable. This is a woman who, where I live, where her car was right outside my house, she grew up maybe 15 blocks away and now lives maybe 7 blocks away. And we know all our own neighbors. She's met our neighbors. I don't think she's a racist person. She's married to a Caribbean Islander, a person of color. But she still felt that unease of leaving her purse in the car. And I think that it's that fear of the other or the unknown. And it's that fear is kind of built in to just the very fabric of our society. And, you know, it's really evident in race relations and how horribly people are treated by the color of their skin or their religion, but it's exacerbated and just an accepted part of our lives. And that hurts me. And I got offended at first when she said that about our purse, because like, why would we live here if we weren't safe? But that fear was just an initial, that anger. And then it was more of a fear and a sadness for what I want to teach my kids. I want them to understand that these are all our neighbors. The world is what we can make of it, right? And yeah, there are places, bad neighborhoods or whatever, where people will rob you, right? I don't know how to process that quite yet, but I do know how to process and deal with the fact that I could be friends with my neighbors and that their strength. The quote that Trey reads at the beginning of every meeting, that Desmond Tutu quote, I almost cry whenever I hear that, because I believe in the interdependence of humanity. We need each other. I need you guys to flourish, to live the best life that I can live. And that's something I want to teach my children. I don't want them to walk through the world with fear or anxiety. It's going to be there, but it's how we deal with that. So I come here so I can learn from people like you about how I can deal with that and pass on those lessons to my kids. And I'm just grateful to be here. Thank you.
Can I chime in for a second?
Conversation, you know.
Hi, Marielle. Anthony, you used the word fear, and I'm thinking about that word a lot because there's something so primal about that emotion that is different than this kind of cerebral eugenics movement that we've seen throughout history. And there's almost something more lasting when we talk about an emotion like fear, because it's so hard to break. It's something that's so, you feel it in your bones. And when we create these communities that are redlined, or that we tell people that this is a safe area, or this is a more transient area, or this is, you know, fill in the blank area, it creates a fear. And I think that that's one of the deepest challenges in a lot of this anti-racism work that we're working towards, is breaking something that is such an instinctual feeling in people, even though because it's a real feeling for them, whether it's founded or not. And Trey and I had a stroll around our neighborhood a few days ago, and we were talking about, I used to live in Cleveland, and I know that Trey's wife Hannah's from there as well. And there's a long history of redlining in that community as well. And you see, I was a 23-year-old white chick from Miami, Florida, who moved to Cleveland, taking classes at Cuyahoga Community College. And I was the only person who was white in my classes. And I remember that there was this, I remember admittedly feeling for the first time that, oh, I was the other. And feeling this sense of discomfort, or how is this going to feel for me? And it's a very intentional thing to have to break fear that has been ingrained in you from the communities that you've grown up in. And so I don't know, I think that word, Anthony, that you use, whether it was intentional or not, it's sticking with me, because I think fear is a hard and scary thing to shed for a lot of people.
This is Maureen. I just wanted to build on that. That was a great story. Past couple of stories. Were you finished? I didn't want to interrupt. Yeah, okay, thanks. Yeah, so I'm Maureen. And I actually there's fear, and then how people change, or how people's thinking change. And I just wanted to share a little story, and it's actually my mom's story. And I've started to tell this because it's helpful, I think, for white people to hear it. But so my mom is she's a very good Republican. I'm white, my mother's white. She's a very good white Republican lady from Westchester County. And she was working at a large national nonprofit in Westchester County. And one of their top executives, who was really the leading fundraiser for the organization, was moving to the headquarters where she worked. And so my mom raised her hand and said, oh, I'll help you find an apartment, and I'll make sure you get an apartment in a good neighborhood. So my mom is driving the new executive around and saying, oh, we should look here, we should look there. This woman is, she's African-American. And so my mom had the experience of actually going in to an apartment complex first and saying, oh, I'm looking for this kind of an apartment. And then her friend coming along and seeing the behavior of the realtor completely change when her friend walked in. This is an executive, a highly paid, extremely successful executive who is in, corporate America for her whole career. Time and again, they developed a little system where my mom would go in first and then her friend would come along and see. My mom made sure she was in a good neighborhood. The words that I'm using them in part intentionally because I think we all have associations with good neighborhood and we have associations with what that experience might be like. But for my mom, who really was pretty sheltered and pretty unaware up until that point, the scales fell from her eyes. She lived that experience through her friend, and they continue to be friends to this day. And through that, the depth of that friendship, my mom has really learned a lot about attitudes in America. But that's a good short story that I have actually shared. I've shared it with sort of people who were skeptics on the fringes of some of the protests in Fairfield, people who didn't really understand. And if when I position that story as really being about a good Republican woman from Westchester that, the people on the fringes might relate to, I'm hopeful that that story can help people understand that these experiences can be transformative to those of us who might not have experienced the reality of the programming that we've had.
Yo, and I have to say, I'm sorry, but and it's a conversation, folks. Y'all could, get in when you want to. But I have to say that, the idea of good neighborhoods, I
read.
I think a lot about
it's coded.
It's coded. It's like
that's why I used it.
Got killed. You know what I mean? He happened to have been a scary Black person apparently in a good neighborhood. And I have to say, in crafting this program, I've been thinking a lot about my 7-year-old who's becoming a bit tall, who's becoming, he's a kid obviously, and he has his curiosities. And Ariel, I think I alluded to this a little bit on our walk, but our neighborhood is changing a bit. New people are coming in. He doesn't have that safety guard, unfortunately, so to speak. The effort, the investment in maintaining good neighborhood, to me, has felt more like ensuring that certain people are kept out, and it compromises the safety of people who don't fit the mold of good.
Yep.
Now, how is it that we've all been conned in maintaining an apartheid, so to speak, lived experience? Because this homogeny is also toxic to white folks, because I think that then it also leaves you with a very narrow world view and experience.
Absolutely.
Yeah, Trey, I thank you everyone for sharing. Thank you, Sonya, and thank you for all of your stories. It's interesting to listen to everyone and think about the dichotomy that history has forced us to live within, right? And thank you, Sonya, for starting off that story with Native American presence in Fairfield and acknowledging that presence of how it came to be. And this idea of zoning, starting with reservation lands and thinking about what's good land and what's bad land. A lot of the land that Native people were placed on and forced to live on and were managed on and given access to was really poor land. With very little farming and agrarian opportunity. If you've ever visited Mashantucket near Foxwoods and you take a hike through the woods, it's the rockiest land you'll ever see in New England. And we grow rocks here, right? But understanding what good and what bad is at any time and what we then have access to in those good and those bad neighborhoods and have the ability to move freely, right? And have access and be free of fear, which is such a key human emotion, is so important to acknowledge in our communities and why we are in any point of discomfort. And so all of this is related through time and it's based in these raw human emotions. And so I just want to thank everybody for sharing their experience and acknowledging that all of this has context, right? And all of it has grown within 400 years. It does not come from out of nowhere. And if you don't acknowledge that and realize that, then we're never going to get to a different place. And so thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Niels. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Sonya. Hi. So I wanted to talk, we talked a lot about like, you know, history and policy and sort of, whoops, lost my camera there. Fear, racism. But I also wanted to talk sort of about the pressures of here and now and what the role that I think whiteness plays. And so I'm a white man with class privilege, race privilege, gender privilege. And as such, I work in the finance industry and I'm often around sort of circles, you know, Fairfield County-like circles, suburban circles. And I had a conversation with someone that really enlightened and sort of hit me home about this, what Sonya and I have talked in the past about. I call it the whiteness trap. And I was at a wedding speaking with a friend who's, you know, fairly wealthy, lives in a suburb like Fairfield County, but elsewhere. And we were talking about social stuff, and she said to me, she's like, you know, it's just universal. We all want our children to have it better than we did. And that sort of triggered, you know, I'm going to bring it to housing, trust me, but it triggered sort of this understanding that when better than we did is financially measured, even in part, and that is taken as a given that we all want our kids to be doing better. And, you know, as is relevant for Fairfield County in many places, we're talking about already like crazy inequities in our favor. The lack of humanity in that and the insanity of that is kind of crazy. But when you really think about what it means about whiteness and real estate values and segregation, is that your choices, if that, and I think it is an ethos in a lot of places in Fairfield County, your choices all of a sudden are extremely narrow, right? To do better than a lot of people are doing in Fairfield County, you have very little choice about what kind of school, what kind of policies, et cetera, to maintain that advantage that's required to make that happen. And then what I think about it when I talk about this whiteness trap is that a lot of people, I mean, I can say that I was brought up thinking that, you know, real estate advice, like it's okay to reach to go to a good neighborhood, and then you have a mortgage. Then you are worried that you can't afford it if the taxes go up. And again, all your choices are narrowed and you can't really support change. And I think that is a huge part of what's going on in Fairfield County with regards to housing racism. So it's not, you know, it built off all the zoning, et cetera, but really on a go forward basis, there's also a big resistance to change. And that resistance to change is rooted in this sort of, this aspect of whiteness that defines success through your children and their educational and earnings power, et cetera. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. Thanks.
Niels, that's what I'm talking about. And I'm John, by the way, everybody. I teach in Fairfield Public Schools. I'm over at Ward. And I'm going to add on to that. The myth of the American dream, or the fallacy of the American dream, I should really say, and especially on the Gold Coast, as was referenced earlier, the idea that somehow, some way, our children have to have better lives than we have, which is financially and economically seemingly impossible. Like how can someone have a better life than someone who lives in like Westport right now? Even how does that even exist? And so the thing that I want to mention is that this is why teaching the importance of language is integral in all of this, because what happens is, it seems like what happens anyway, is that through the codification of all of these laws and these zoning sort of, you know, mandates, is that we can now turn the language of racism into the language of economics. And so if we teach kids what dog whistling is, if we teach kids that that whiteness hides behind words in order to not be overtly racist, we can teach them how to navigate the system and how to sort of deconstruct and then hopefully, you know, raze, R-A-Z-E, the structures that exist. So semiotics, like I heard somebody mention before, context, right? Like how we use these words in context is extremely important for us to be teaching our children so they can call it out if and when, not if, when it occurs in the world around them, and especially in the local political scenes that it usually occurs in. So I just wanted to mention that like this happens in the classroom as well as in the political realm as well. Thanks.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
John, something you just said reminded me of a conversation Trey and I had where this idea of a better life often is just code for things, stuff, not meaning and relationships, and this more holistic view of what is fulfilling in life. And we are passing that to our kids with that message that a better life is more stuff and not the pursuit of more fulfillment and meaning, and perhaps even a full range of emotions. Sorrow and joy is all still part of a meaningful and better life. And I know this is housing specific, but I think it's also related because I hear so many times the best type of housing is also single family detached home ownership. And I don't want to say that that should be accessible to everybody who wants it, but it's not necessarily better. People might want optionality. Like there are reasons to want different types of housing also. And we should have those types of housing in every community so that you can have access to the opportunities in a community and the type of housing that fits your needs. And so I sort of see that language being really central to a lot of this discussion.
I just want to share a tiny little story. One of my kids, we are in a white family. We live in this Stratfield neighborhood of Fairfield. So we often drive through Bridgeport, especially on Capitol Avenue. Anyhow, one of my kids is just absolutely in love with those multifamily homes, those multifamily buildings. And I just, first of all, so am I. I love that style of a home. And, you know, I have never said to my kids that that's not a good neighborhood, or I've never tried to correct it. But I really, when he says that, I always have a message in my head that says, you know what, this is an opportunity for me to socialize my child in a certain way. And I've chosen to not do it. That's a tiny example, but that is a tiny example of how white people can make very small choices about what to inculcate into their children. So just sharing that, talking about building on what you just said.
Yeah, if I may, Maureen, I love that you said that. Oftentimes I'm going to get off this call and I'm going to be like, wait, what was the point of that? The point of this, part of the point of this is also to, John's laughing. Yeah, I think we're supposed to educate each other and kind of offer up, so to speak, ways in which then we remedy this issue, correct? That's really the deal here. And for me, at least, it is that, as John has talked about language and all that, it is that we've associated, Redline, I should say, has contributed, so to speak, to how we enforce and maintain racist ideas, right? Good neighborhoods, bad neighborhoods, good schools, bad schools, good people live in good neighborhoods, bad people live in, well, bad neighborhoods. And our goal and our work should be to challenge those ideas, right? And I think you only do that by being intentional about how you challenge those ideas, right? Do you actually go into Bridgeport and deal with it as though you're in a neighborhood and not the Bridgeport or the bad neighborhood, right? I think that that's where I'm at with this, where too often we get here and we get on our soapbox and we can talk passionately about this and the other. But I think the goal here is, the point here is, are we prepared to start to introduce new language to how we speak about these quote unquote distressed neighborhoods, right? These where economically folks are struggling. Economically, folks are disenfranchised, and economically, people are suffering, right? And not associate them and their condition to a character flaw. Does that make sense?
Yep.
That was the goal for me, because I realized that I've been around educators even who have talked about their educational experience in bad schools, um, and I'm like, wait, what do you mean, right? And I think I was one of those students who was a troubling student, or a bad whatever. But those are the very people who are have the grit and the whatever it takes, so to speak, to get by. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
So I think I have to make sure I put this piece out there so that we don't lose sight of what the point of this was. Amanda, thoughts?
I think, Trey, the intentionality that you mentioned is really important. I hear kids in Fairfield so often saying something disparaging about Bridgeport, and I'm always quick to jump in and say, well, hey, that's where I grew up and lived for 30 years. And, you know, I lived in one of those multifamily houses on Capitol Ave. And the interesting thing about it is a lot of these kids are talking about this area, someplace that they would never go into. And really, you know, it's 100 feet from where they're standing is Bridgeport. That's supposedly so scary and so a place that you don't really want to go to. So I think it's important that we kind of turn that narrative on its head when we hear it, and when we hear people saying things about these areas. I mean, Bridgeport has such a vibrant art scene, and to not acknowledge that and to acknowledge all the amazing stuff that is happening there, and just to focus on this supposed crime and you know, dangerous place that's happening. I mean, growing up in Bridgeport, I never felt unsafe walking anywhere. And sometimes I even felt more welcome being there than I did when I would go into Fairfield, because it would feel like, you know, I didn't belong. I didn't have enough money. I wasn't able to kind of fit in and, you know, be a part of that group. So I think, you know, when we do hear things, and we hear especially young people or anybody actually saying things about these areas, that we have to be intentional in saying, well, hey, or even just questioning it. If you hear somebody say good schools or bad neighborhoods, say, what do you really mean by that? You know, or when you say bad neighborhood, what are you actually saying? You know, and by kind of throwing that question back at somebody to kind of find out what's really meant by it, that can kind of really open up the conversation to be able to say, okay, so now we're not really talking about crime, we're talking about racism, or, you know, it's can kind of bring it into what's actually being said, the subtext of it all.
There's so many important things here. I just wanted to point out that John's mention of language and Trey's mention of action and taking action, because that is why we're having these conversations of what can we do to change what we know from what we've learned here today. And there's a lot of pieces and parts that I think are important, but it really starts with language. And, you know, some of the things that I found most helpful in, you know, in this education part is developing resources for other people to locate and listen to the coded language. What does it actually mean? So is there an opportunity to create a graphic that says, when you say good neighborhood, this is what you're saying in Fairfield? Because so many of these are oriented to our community and our context and our neighborhoods that we're familiar with. You can't always bring the language that we use in Fairfield and Bridgeport in these communities elsewhere, because different words are being used, especially when you go out in New England, right? The South uses all sorts of interesting different language that I don't even, it's like a whole different world down there. You know, just understanding, you know, do we have a graphic that says, here, this is Fairfield language, and this is the systemic racist elements that are happening here, and how can we fix it? What words can we use that really accurately describe with all of that cultural context behind it? So not that I build exhibits or do anything like that or create graphics, but just wondering if that would be helpful for all of us to consider about how can we change the language that we're using, that we are teaching your kids, that we're using in schools, that our politicians and reps and First Select Women's Office are using, for the Diversity and Equity Task Force in town, for the, you know, is this a shared language where we say, hey, what does this really mean?
What I'm definitely hearing out of this conversation is the need for not just more conversations, but some follow-up information and steps. And so I think the Fairfield Yabantu team will work on getting that out to everybody. There's been a lot of articles posted in the chat. And so maybe we'll just combine all of these things and more resources and maybe some graphics to use. Wouldn't it be interesting? I don't know if they have sort of zoning meetings by Zoom right now, but if everybody put a graphic of language, of coded language up on their Zoom screen during a meeting, that would be kind of an interesting action to do. So I just really want to thank everybody for coming and for sharing. And I don't want this to end, but I really also want to respect everybody's time. It's 8:37 and we will continue these conversations by Zoom, and we'll continue them over email, and we'll make sure that, you know, our hope is always that these conversations prime people so that when action is needed, everybody's ready. And I feel a lot of readiness in this call. So I look forward to what we can come up with. In the meantime, oh, Trey has one more thing. Go ahead.
Real quick, please look out for that email to support our fellow healthcare worker during these tough times. I hope and I look forward to ensuring that she gets the support that she needs, especially because, and I'm all about the kids. She's got 2 young kids who are like 5 and 6, and some of the help that she'll need, and we're going to email you about this, isn't just financial help. You know, some of it is, you know, I'm getting ready to send some toys. The kids may need to go outside and walk and run around for a bit. I'm overdue for some running. So it's going to be very diverse in what, you know, how and what we can do to help her out in a true Yabantu and Ubuntu fashion. So please look out for those emails and ways in which you can help.
Yes, the GoFundMe page is already in the original email that everybody should have gotten with the whole list of the How the House Was Built series, but then we will include it in this next email as well. So there's that. And then I hope everybody can join us next week for our conversation on education, which will be amazing.